Hello, everyone. Hello, or good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So welcome to the RIHN 15th International Symposium, Transitioning Cultures of Everyday Food Consumption and Production, Stories from a Post-Growth Future. Actually, long title. So this is the fourth and the last day of the symposium. We are coming back to the time zone covering Asian, Pacific, and American regions again. So my name is, yes, thank you. So it is 9:30 in the morning here in Kyoto. The weather is sunny, not so much cold. So it's a nice winter morning, I would say. So how about your area? Wish you all have a nice atmosphere to enjoy the symposium. I am Norie Tamura, or in Japanese way, Tamura Norie to iimasu, from the fifth project of RIHN. I will chair today's keynote and the session 4. Before starting the keynote, I would like to quickly recap the yesterday's sessions and discussions. So yesterday, we had the session 3, named as the food alternative in the present. Petra Jolichka introduced living informal food practice in Europe, Eastern European countries and reframed its meanings. After that, Marilyn Sahakian shared as her project in Switzerland about the making transition toward sustainable and healthy food systems. As a third speaker, Mai Kobayashi speculated the unattended food stands and its foodscape in Japan. And finally, Belen brought us through the visionary legume-based food system and its pathway. After the session 3, we invited 3 practitioners from Japan, India, and the United Kingdom, and had a roundtable discussion and speculated the views or ideas from the ground, on the ground. As some of you may know already, we are running this symposium in 2 different platforms. One is Zoom, as you enjoy, I hope, now, and then the other is Slack. I recommend you to introduce yourself in the Slack channel or ask questions. Please feel free to pitch any questions. So the speakers or presentators are happy to comment, reply your questions after symposium. You would like to involve as many as people from the world. So we need to take over the time zone issues. Maybe Slack workspace benefit us to keep communicating during and after symposium. Okay. So we would like to, today we start with the keynote address from the Professor Michael Cohen, Colorado State University of USA. His keynote is Food Justice Encounters that Endanger Empathy Across the Difference. I know many of you already know him. He's a food sociologist, and his books and the papers shape the discourse of the food sociology. And we feel very much impressed or affected his discourses. So it is more than happy for us. We can invite him as a keynote address of today. So okay, so that we will start the presentation. Okay, we need to solve a minor problem now, so please wait a minute. During this time, I would like to use for my to share my personal opinion. As I introduced already, Michael Kellen is a big scholar, I would say, but adding to that, personally, I feel I really like his writing pieces. I strongly recommend all of you to read his articles. So reading his papers or reading his book is, for me, the more than academic experience. I think this
I would like to begin by thanking the organizing committee. Pulling off an international meeting in the best of
okay,
times
the
is an
sound,
immense
sounds now
undertaking.
come on, so
To have done
we will
so during
start
a
again.
global pandemic, well, the organizers should receive some sort of award for what they've accomplished. Thanks to you all. What data would change the mind of a bigot or a climate change denier to make them think otherwise? We must come to terms with the overwhelming empirical evidence concerning how cultural and political beliefs filter the facts we choose to see and acknowledge. Traditional liberal political theories continue to advocate the idea that good old-fashioned, well-reasoned talk holds the potential to solve any ill. How can that be if we hear only what we want? We have a term for this, motivated reasoning. Rather than using facts to objectively arrive at a political decision, or any decision, really, this framework argues that we rationalize our way into decisions we originally wanted to make. This occurs thanks to both confirmation bias, a tendency to look only for information we agree with, and disconfirmation bias, which involves systematically dismissing information that we disagree with. These biases are also especially strongly correlated with partisanship. This explains the tendency to reduce debates to being about left versus right on the political spectrum, whether talking about climate change, COVID-19, mask wearing, or whether Black Lives Matter. The more we identify with a political party, the more we work to find ways to have our beliefs confirmed. In one study, authors analyzed climate change survey data from three populations: the US public, scientists actively publishing on energy technologies, and congressional policy advisors. Its findings uncovered, quote, evidence that the ideological divide about global warming gets significantly larger according to respondents' knowledge about politics, energy, and science, unquote. More knowledge, in other words, was shown to increase the divide between climate change skeptics and those believing it to be real and human induced. Strategies forward need to be informed by these realizations. Drawing from more than a dozen social experiments and a number of natural ones, which I've conducted and observed over the last decade, my lecture today outlines the thesis of a forthcoming book with Stanford University Press. The book unpacks those experiences that touched participants so deeply that some of those cognitive filters changed. In other instances, I show how partisan motivated reasoning was leveraged to enroll participation of the very individuals you would expect to be least interested in fostering empathy toward historically marginalized groups. Some experiments described even providing clues about when facts are more likely to matter, but only after individuals were primed by those embodied encounters. Why food? As opposed to creating encounters with the expressed purpose of coming together to hash out differences, which generally results in people becoming immediately defensive, food has a disarming quality. When you come into a space because of food, or to learn about food and or food systems, we generally do so in a way that elicits different attitudes and outlooks than if the encounter is explicitly about confronting something as uncomfortable as social otherness, incivility, and hate. In short, not only are most people generally open to learning more about food, but they also tend to do so in a way that makes them open to other encounters, which creates interesting openings for understanding and compassion for otherwise socially othered groups. Why now? As opposed to, looking at national polling data from 2018, 69% believe we have a major civility problem in the United States. Hate groups are active at an all-time level, not only in my own country, but in other countries too. The American Psychological Association cites the current political climate as a major stressor for their members' clients. Among Generation Z adults, 69% feel very or somewhat stressed about our national future, with 55% calling out specifically the political environment as a source of discomfort and stress. It is such a mess out there that I am reluctant to call what we are seeing incivility, which seems tame. People can fight, and friends can fight, but this seems much, much worse. Looking at what we are facing, mass shootings, some intentionally targeting immigrant communities, pipe bombs being mailed to politicians, chants of "send her back" directed at Somali-born congresswoman here in the United States, teens being physically assaulted for their choice of political apparel, misogyny, sexism. The list goes on and on. The why now question ought to be obvious. One strategy growing in popularity for restoring stability to our politics is professionally facilitated conversations. I've attended dozens of these where people with divergent outlooks and political beliefs gather and talk it out. The problem with this solution is that the conversations are designed for those already willing to jump headlong into the uncertain. Inspiring stories come from these events where self-proclaimed enemies become friends, but that only happens when both sides open themselves to the possibility. And there is the rub. These events are aimed principally at tackling incivility among individuals who can already demonstrate a level of civility and respect to those confronted. What makes people want to participate in these events in the first place? That is the unasked question we need to be finding answers to. To answer this question, I've been conducting, for lack of a better word, social experiments, which includes observing some natural ones too, for the better part of 10 years, ranging from having people on the political right participate in what's colloquially known as food stamp challenges for weeks on end, living, in other words, on a food budget dictated by government food stamp allocations. I conducted an 8-year longitudinal study of people working off part of their subscription to a CSA, which brought together people of different races, classes, nationalities, and sexual orientations with very interesting effects. I had people spend days picking berries and detasseling corn to see how these experiences impacted their views of immigrant laborers and conventional ag producers, respectively. I brought progressive urban foodies to wild game dinners where they ate wild game with conservative rural gun enthusiasts. I also detailed my experiences building rural-urban linkages in Colorado while working to connect Denver's urban food plan with rural communities and rural food producers from around the state. I will focus the remainder of my time on one of my experiments and try to ethnographically detail the factors that shape the role of affect, embodiment, and practice in shaping our moral geographies, which is to say our beliefs about how the world is and ought to be, which has profound consequences in how we think about things, people, food, politics, and the like. To do this, however, I want to present my data a bit differently than is typical for a research presentation. If my thesis is that we've gotten our priorities mixed up in terms of how we understand not only politics, but also how we think about human behavior and attitudes, namely that what we do and think is less about what we're told and more about how we feel and experience the world, then it would be truly foolish of me to be here today and spout off facts and data devoid of the experiences themselves. And so, following the writer's maxim about the importance of showing the reader rather than telling them, I've decided to incorporate some ethnographic elements into this lecture as well, which will involve me trying to show you with words the experiences themselves. So for this study, I recruited 31 individuals who were identified by reaching out to contacts in the state of California, friends of friends, and in some cases, friends of friends of friends. The aim was to enlist individuals who were, as I had described them, quote, pro-wall and anti-immigration, the more so, the better, unquote. Is there a way to make more visible the bodies that populate our food system? Practices with the potential to instill empathy within eaters toward those who feed us? Having rented a U-pick berry farm for a day, I put those 31 individuals to work to see how the experience might have impacted them in terms of their feelings toward otherwise invisible immigrants who pick our strawberries and raspberries. I rented out the strawberry portion of the U-pick for the morning, taking over the farm's raspberry beds in the afternoon. Participants were told to come covered up, long pants and sleeves, something for the head, and if they had them, work boots, all to mimic the dress of the industrial berry picker. They were also instructed on how laborers pick to maximize their productivity. Strawberries, from what I've been told by those in the industry, require a particular technique, legs slightly spread, bent at the waist like a runner frozen mid-floor stretch. This frees both hands for the pick. I was not able to discern an industry-wide style for picking raspberries, so participants were given more leeway for that fruit as long as they worked fast. Realizing that water breaks are a luxury for immigrant laborers, participants were also discouraged from spending too much time at the water cooler. Participants were instructed to use the mobile devices to capture images of their time picking. I was especially interested in seeing if and how the photos changed during the course of the day, to see, in other words, if the experience's physicality would imprint itself into the images. The photos yielded some interesting data. The day started with the group taking countless landscape images, plus a number of selfies. A few individuals even displayed some talent. Most of the pictures looked like they could have been on a postcard. You know, the type where the beauty is eulogized and there's not much personal insight on the image. But what I found really interesting is that by afternoon, the pictures took on a different character. By afternoon, exertion became the muse, and sweat, stains, and dirt took over as the center of interest, as illustrated by this picture, and there are others that were representative of this as well. Participants were interviewed twice, roughly 1 week before and 1 week after the experience. The first to establish an attitudinal baseline, and the second to see if that baseline had moved. Additional data were collected by asking participants to complete a brief survey, again, once before and once after. In this particular survey, I drew inspiration from one designed by a team of researchers in Belgium who were measuring attitudes toward immigration there. And as you can see, the questions here get at their views about what they think are quote unquote good immigrants, looking at issues related to the languages they speak, the color of their skin, their educational qualities, and the like. Give you a moment to look that over. In the next slide. So this figure depicts the average score for all 5 questions at both points in time, before and after field work. My initial directive was to only enroll pro-wall and anti-immigration participants, and it looks like the mission was accomplished. The figure also makes clear that this group was not dead set against immigration per se. They had few qualms with immigrants who were privileged, English-speaking, and white. Also clear from the figures the fact that these attitudes can and did change. I tried something new for this experiment, triangulating web analytics with the other data. Specifically, a website was created and populated with information about industrial berry production, with particular attention placed on labor practices. The site was populated by secondary data gleaned from government and non-government agencies, links to relevant documentaries and video clips, and news articles. An email was sent to all participants immediately after receiving their consent to participate. In addition to containing information about what laid ahead, the message directed them to that website. Quote, for those wanting background information on industrial strawberry and raspberry production, please give this website a look, unquote, they were instructed. A few days before our second interview, participants were sent another email and reminded about the website. Behind the scenes, I was monitoring traffic onto the site and tracked navigation through it. As it could only be accessed by the hot link, I could be confident that those visiting had been invited to do so. And when they were interviewed, I confirmed that the link had not been shared. Two of the 31 participants clicked on the link when it was first sent, with only one navigating past the home page. Evidence of motivated reasoning, I would argue. But when emailed the link for a second time, after their time in the field, 20 participants clicked through, a 900% increase, and of those, all navigated past the home page. Now, I never said information has no role to play in our politics. Facts remain a powerful force for changing hearts and minds, as long as those hearts and minds have already been primed for change. Engagements that get people to open up, to accept exposure to data that might challenge and upset established beliefs is what we ought to be creating. The question I was interested in answering with the web analytics was, did the experiment make people want to learn about industrial berry production? The answer to that question appears to be an unqualified yes, based on the data described. But not only that, the information on the website appears to have eventually pierced through participants' cognitive filters. I know this because some parroted facts listed on the website during our second interview, such as names of top producing US states and countries for strawberry production, pesticides recently banned by the European Union, and rates of pesticide poisoning among laborers. Turns out we can change people's minds with the help of a little nudge from their bodies. Now to showing you some data, introduce you to Ralph, who is a white racist, to speak frank. I first met Ralph, a giant of a man, at a cafe less than a 20-minute drive from what he would later describe on more than one occasion as the U-pick from hell. He arrived early to this meeting spot with his two teenage children. When I showed up, they were playing checkers. He was supervising all 6 feet 10 inches of them, occasionally offering advice. A surly-looking fella in green fatigues, he cut an imposing figure. Leaving the kids to their game, we retreated to a private room that I had reserved. It was 2018, and the immigration issue was all over the news and social media. Ralph seemed eager to talk about border security. Quote, it's a crisis. We can't stop them coming over. Those that are here are taking welfare and jobs. We need to look after our own first, unquote. The them and those he was referring to are immigrants, though he never fully clarified if he was referring to only the undocumented ones. Not that an immigrant's legal status likely mattered to him. He seemed most concerned about where individuals immigrated from. The first interview with Ralph was uncomfortable, one of the most uncomfortable of my career. The first time he used a derogatory term to describe Mexicans, I asked him, politely but firmly, to choose his words more carefully in the future when in my presence. I did not wish to hear any more of that rhetoric or risk having the nearby kids hear it, at least not on my watch. His feelings were abundantly clear with that one remark. Additional would not have added any further insight. That intervention did not stop him from expressing his disdain toward this group, though he did do a better job minding his P's and Q's from that point. The experience ultimately heightened my interest in Ralph during the day of the pick, mostly out of a sense of caution. The day started with me laying out some ground rules like being respectful of others and only using language appropriate around elementary school children. I did not want Ralph or anyone hijacking the day by saying or doing something inappropriate. Don't get me wrong, I was glad to have Ralph there with us. If these experiments cannot touch the Ralphs of the world, then what's the point? Ralph showed up early, looking the part. He had on a long-sleeve flannel shirt, gray Carhartt pants, and a bandana wrapped atop his head. Not long after arriving, he made friends with a gentleman over coffee and pastries. They both had spent an extended period of time in Germany and used the occasion to reminisce. All that banter did nothing to slow Ralph's strawberry picking pace. He easily outperformed the others, close to double the average of the group. When complimented on his strawberry picking skills, he absently remarked nothing to it. While he did not say it, he was clearly proud of his picking prowess. Over lunch, he used the accomplishment to remind me of his disdain toward immigrants. Quote, if someone my size can handle this, I think it would be a walk in the park for some little Hispanic half my size. Then came the afternoon. The day was very warm. The weather app on my phone read 92 degrees. I did not know the exact temperature under those raspberry tunnels, though the sweat dripping off my nose gave me an idea of what it could have been. We were about an hour into the afternoon pick when I heard Ralph call out, permission to take my shirt off, boss. He was looking at me. I had watched enough movies depicting prison labor to get the reference. It's a term used often in those films. Not that he was suggesting that this was a prison and that I a guard. He said it in a friendly enough manner. I also know that hierarchical individualists, those who value stratification and who expect individuals to secure their own well-being, generally expect situations to be governed by someone in a position of authority. Ralph, a white, male, registered Republican, checked all the right boxes for being a hierarchical individualist. I know enough about them to know one when I hear one. His comments about people needing to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and about how, quote, the poor are poor for a reason, unquote, held a hallmark of someone harboring that particular value set. In me, being another white male with a track record of putting him in his place, no doubt had something to do with him placing me as that person of authority. Affirming his request with a nod, he took off his shirt. He then turned, revealing a large Celtic cross across his back, a symbol I know to be used in some white nationalist circles. It was clear that the heat and exertion was making Ralph uncomfortable. The shirt started off blue, but by afternoon it had turned violet, almost black from the perspiration. Any comfort gained by going shirtless proved to be short-lived. Less than 5 minutes had passed since granting his request before he blurted out, shit, damn it. A body the size of Ralph's is hard to navigate in the confines of a raspberry tunnel, and he was truly uncomfortable. And he told me so during our second interview. We did reunite about a week later at the same cafe we had met prior. When asked during the first interview if he looked at the website created for the experiment, he glibly answered with a chuckle, yeah, no, didn't have time. He did look, however, prior to our second meeting at the cafe. This itself is not an earth-shattering behavioral change, if you can even describe it in those terms. It is not the act, the click, that interests me, but that he voluntarily recited information from the website during that second interview. quote, almost all of the strawberries produced in the US come from California, with Florida in a distant second place, unquote. He was also able to enumerate pesticide poisoning rates, quote, almost 200,000 people die every year from self-poisoning. Self-poisoning? I assume that's a nice way of saying suicide, unquote. That too came from that website. The World Health Organization places the figure at 170,000 self-poisoned pesticide deaths annually. He had not just visited the website, he studied it. Noting this observation, I asked why. He looked almost embarrassed, hesitant maybe. I can't quite explain what I saw in his face other than to say it was not a look I had expected to see on this overly confident, imposing man. Quote, call it a case of curiosity, he told me, adding, maybe I wanted to learn something. Let's leave it at that. Here was a case of a man who neither cared about immigrants nor wanted to learn about their plight as immigrants when we first met. During our first interview, he in fact told me that, quote, those figures that tell how bad immigrants have it is all fake news, unquote. But by the second interview, something changed. He started to express interest in their livelihoods and their experiences as immigrants, as evidenced by his newfound willingness to look at that website, memorize the facts there, which were previously described as fake, and by what he told me, have a genuine change of heart. While I certainly will not say he has fully come around to the plight of socially marginalized groups by any stretch of the imagination, he is further along that path now than he was before the experiment. To be clear, I'm not suggesting I found a solution to what is troubling the world today. Take these findings as opening new doors for empirical investigation, as generating, in other words, new research questions. Who doesn't know the virtues of empathy? It's embedded in every major world religion. And yet, our empathy for poor and the socially othered groups around the world is still terribly lacking. So what are we to do? Well, I would argue we need to think big by, wait for it, going small. Only through the quotidian and mundane can we hope to circumvent those filters. We need to change practices if we hope to change attitudes. I acknowledge that the focus of my forthcoming book is on human others, a focus that I've justified and explained. But I do think there are some lessons to be learned through this research for dealing with issues related to non-human animals, climate change, and the like. There's something deeply amiss with how humans engage with other humans and how we interact with the world. After all, it's humans who are denying climate change, not non-human animals. And because of that, the whole world burns. So you could say that through this research, I'm also trying to address some of the fundamental first principles that are not only responsible for placing such strain on democratic institutions around the world, but that are also responsible for grave environmental injustices. In other words, I'm not convinced we can solve today's environmental crises without first addressing those fundamental social, political, and cultural crises, which I'm trying to make sense of through this research by investigating the roles of affect, embodiment, and practice. To get there, we need to abandon the premise that the problem is just a matter of differing opinions, disagreements that can be fixed with more and better knowledge and education. With so many steadfast in their belief that they are on the right side of history and just plain right in their convictions, it is foolish to think any meaningful encounters can be had where the expressed purpose is acknowledging we are wrong while admitting the true claim of others. This also explains my fascination with food. It can both motivate and disarm, creating a potential entry point to understanding without participants even knowing it. The aim should not be about telling people to change their convictions. People have to get there by their own choosing. We cannot force people to become empathetic and caring. That will just have the opposite effect, but that's okay. With the opportunities afforded to us by food, all we have to do is leverage that interest and wonderment in ways that create new experiences. That's how we change minds, by changing embodiments. Thank you all so much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Oh, hello again. Thank you very much, Professor Kellen. The great keynote speech. It is quite great, but more meaningful and impressive after experience that brutal event in the United States last week. Somehow I am disappearing, but I am here. Okay, I would like to move to the question and comment, but before that, Professor Kieran, can you show up? Hello.
Hello.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You have a great talk. Yes.
Oh, well, thank you.
I see that many people has a big question, but I would like to start from the Ashley Colby. Ashley, can you ask by yourself? Ashley, are you there? No? Oh. I see Ashley Colby is online, but can you ask by yourself? No? Okay, I will read her question on behalf of her. So your work overlaps so much with my work and perspective, and there's much cross-pollination, which I'd love to discuss after her presentation. So I am focused on, so I'll just ask from your perspective, what is the most widespread way you could pollinatory image scaling up the potential for more shared experience? How about Professor Kieran?
That's an excellent question. I guess for the moment, it's a tough one to say, Ashley, in terms of scaling up. I guess what I'm most interested in thinking about, at least at the moment, is trying to think about those prefigurative moments that precede collective organization or social movements itself, or the scaling up itself too, because at least from a perspective of sociology, we have a rich history and literature dealing with collective mobilization and social movements, but I still don't feel like we really understand the fact that in the end, people have to still choose to want to participate in these movements. They still have to decide that the world ought to be changed. And I don't think we have a good understanding in terms of what, in a sense, motivates people to risk life and limb or to engage in some of these activities. And the traditional understandings of human behavior in terms of thinking about the relationship between attitudes and behaviors and the role of knowledge, I've just found them to be wildly inaccurate and unsatisfying, because we know also there's a rich literature that points out that we have these cognitive filters, and that that knowledge in and of itself is not often enough to motivate people to do certain things, precisely because we tend to only hear what we want to hear. And so that got me thinking in terms of what are some of the sources of these cognitive filters. And I keep coming back to this idea of affect and embodiment and emotion as playing some sort of role in shaping what information we allow to get through to us and what information we keep out. And with the information, the data that I've tried to show in this keynote, try to talk about where does knowledge come into play, and how can we tune people to be more open to particular forms of knowledge that might otherwise not be, who might not otherwise be attuned to it. And so that's why I showed that website data, because I think it helps us unpack where does knowledge play an important role and where do other things play an important role. So I realize, Ashley, this could be something that you and I talk more about, but in terms of the scaling up, I just haven't gotten there yet in terms of being able to think through how one goes about doing this at a larger scale, other than trying to create and afford opportunities at a larger scale at a governmental level in order to make possible some of these engagement and embodiments. So that's my very poor answer, Ashley.
Thank you. by the way, did you record this recording before that so-called capital storming?
I did record it well before
Wow,
what happened last week.
Yeah. So anticipatory. So, okay, now the Gregory Ashaoli. Sorry, I may not pronounce correctly. Can you talk? Can you talk? Gregory, can you talk? I can hear. Well, I know you said just a comment, not a question, but I think is it difficult? Okay, let's keep on. I may be back. Well, so suddenly many people are pitching the question to us. Just for your information, please use the hashtag 16th keynote channel to post your question. Okay, I would like to invite Ilan Chabey. Can Ilan, can you talk?
Yes, I'm here. Hi, thank you very much, Michael, for your talk. It's really excellent and fascinating on several levels. The question I have, and part of what I pursue in a rather different way, much of what you talk about with the attitudes and the relationship to current events and fake news and so forth has to do, another way to characterize it is through narratives that people are invested in, whether that's a narrative of their social identity, and there are usually multiple ones, as you well know. I'm curious whether you see ways that because I was very impressed by how you empirically looked at this. And I'm curious if you have looked at, or if you would see good ways to examine also the narratives that lie, sort of behind the social identities that you identified.
Yeah, thanks for your question. And I think you commented on one of the short pieces that I posted, one of which contained some word clouds. And I have been thinking about, and I apologize if this doesn't answer your question. I think it does, though, on how people embody certain narratives. And I haven't unpacked the narratives of sustainability, but I have unpacked the narrative, for instance, of social justice. And as you know, and anecdotally, I can only guess, but sustainability is as heterogeneous as social justice is in terms of how people think about and understand and embody and feel about it. And so I can tell you from my own research that looking at, for instance, social justice and from people's standpoint, say in the political spectrum and the narratives that they have, and this is probably no surprise to you either, but social justice just is not a narrative that's almost even in the vocabulary of certain people on the political spectrum. So if you want to evoke behavioral change from people dealing around sustainability, evoking the narrative of social justice will only bring you half of the way, right? And it'll turn off the other half of the population as well, who might respond more to narratives around nationalism or patriotism or things like that. And so I think to your point that narratives are really important, because the words we use, we may all use the same words, but not only do we not understand those words similarly, because of our deeper cultural values that we hold, some of those words might actually be turning off the very people that we're trying to bring on board, especially with dealing with climate change. I see that as particularly problematic, that the narratives that those of us who lean left tend to use, thinking that will bring people on the right on board, actually turns them off, and it's being detrimental to our cause. So I appreciate that question because it's so important.
Thank you. appreciate it. If I may just say one other thing, that part of the problem, which I think is so important with the food issue, because if one takes sustainability and takes a specific issue within that, much more understandable than the broad concept of SDGs and sustainability for most people.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. The social dividing between so-called right and left is also becoming so big issues in Japan too. So, and it is very fascinating vision that food or the through the food practice, we can bridge or we can reconcile those two dividing pieces. It's a very envisioning. So in that sense, I would like to invite Hein Malay to ask his related, I think, questions.
Yes, thank you. The Ralph story was really fascinating. I think my physique is probably similar to his, and I spent the summer picking strawberries as a kid in high school, so I can relate to his trials and tribulations. But so I think for the current audience, this story is a very sort of satisfying one. How about, you mentioned taking left-leaning urban foodies to a wild meat party with gun-loving farmers or something of the kind. What happens to them? And sort of, I imagine that story may be less satisfying to the people who are on this conference today.
Yeah, thank you for that question. When I was thinking about which case studies to talk about, I really wanted to talk about that one, but it is so complex and nuanced that when I tried to put something together, I never got close to the 30-minute time limit. So I went with something that was a little bit easier in terms of storytelling. As you can all imagine, the issues around guns, while politically charged all around the world, are just as politically charged here in the United States as well. The one thing I can say that I can say quickly, because I know time is short, is that one thing that I found interesting, because we also have this very large rural-urban divide in the United States, as exists all around the world too, and it really helped create a pivot point where, for a number of people who are gun enthusiasts, there's Second Amendment gun issues, but then also embedded within those narratives are also feelings of being left behind as a rural population and some anxiety around that particular identity, because that is a group. If some folks have read a paper of mine in a recent issue of Rural Sociology, I talk about how rural people feel injustices being placed upon them and their ways of living too. That offered some really interesting opportunities for people in urban settings who have very little experience with rural individuals to begin to understand that it's not really just about guns. We can all probably have guessed that, but it also deals with essentially some very real rural anguish that are being expressed through guns and other things too. And I think that was, to make this more of an optimistic sort of statement, that was fairly eye-opening and created some understanding that didn't exist prior, because that tends to be one of the most dichotomous issues in the United States, where if you like guns, you're a gun nut, and then if not, then you're on the other side, and there's no middling in that issue. And it helped people see gun enthusiasts in a somewhat different way. And I'll end it there. I appreciate that question. It's a very important one.
Thank you very much. That was illuminating.
Okay, so the next one is the last question. So Miyake-san of the Nagoya University, can you ask by yourself?
Yes, can you hear me? And
yes, please.
Yes.
Okay. And thank you for the great talk and very theoretical and interesting cases. And my question is, why do you choose make people experience strawberry picking on the production side rather than having people come together and eating the same Mexican US dishes together? I think that it's easier to understand and make people agree through the experience of eating, because we experience eating, and I think we are somehow programmed to be more interested in the food we eat throughout the history And I think the taking people to the ground is, one step further than that. So I want to know why did you think the case study to be done that way?
Thank you so much for that question. It's a very important one. I did not disregard that entirely, as evidenced by the last question, because I did bring people together literally around a table, left and right, pro-gun, anti-gun. And so I see those spaces as being incredibly important in and of themselves. But in the same respect too, has been quite a bit of research that also empirically documents the social ability of eating together around the table. But then in the same respect, in the context of globalization and other things like that, I'm intrigued to try to think of ways in which we can create understanding between people who are separated, for instance, by great differences. How could something that we do locally cause us to be empathetic toward people who, say, are suffering in the genocide in the Darfur region, or suffering in another country, or suffering in workplaces that are employed by making shoes for Nike or something like that. And so I was trying to think of creative ways maybe we could afford embodiments that don't bring people together physically, in part because there are some people who cannot be brought together physically because of globalization, and also because of power differentials as well. In the United States, for instance, I'd be pretty reluctant to bring an undocumented Mexican laborer to the same table as a white nationalist, for instance. And so I'm wondering if there were ways in which we could create embodiments that afford this sort of understanding and compassion and empathy that's separate from, or in addition to, eating around a table, which I agree is incredibly important and incredibly powerful too. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, you can certainly take the undocumented worker to the field to do the field study with your research participants, I think. So thank you for your answer. I understand that.
So thank you very much. Okay, so now I would like to, for the time being, I would like to conclude the keynote address here. So thank you again. Thank you very much, the Professor Makio-Kyoen. It was really, really great talk. So all of us enjoy, I definitely think so. So we would like to take a short break, 5 minutes break, not 5 minutes, 8, 6, I'm not sure. Anyway, 7? Every people say different things, maybe 6 or 7. Anyway, in Japanese Standard Time 10:30, I would like to restart from the session 4. So see you again. Hi, welcome back again. I would like to restart. So now we are moving to the session 4, Sufficiency and Cultural Change. Reflecting the wonderful keynote from the Makio-Kyoen, we will see the speakers will tell the power of narrative of the new visions of foodscape or any other stories. You know, the title of this symposium has stories from a post-growth futures. So I would like to start the first presentation from Ilan Chobey, the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Germany. Let's get started.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be able to share some ideas with you this morning at the last day of this marvelous conference. It has been really a feast of ideas and inspiring moments and rich material to process for all of us, I think. I want to talk today about sufficiency, and I've entitled it Willingly Sliding Down the Slope, because we need to find ways to decrease our consumption, slide down the slope. And the first part of the talk will be about sufficiency briefly, and the second part about narratives, and in particular how those might be used in an effective way in games. So sustainability, as we all know, is a normative aspiration for just and equitable well-being within the limits of available resources, natural resources, both for the present and for future human society, which we have to also see as an integral part of all living systems. But we have increasing population, we have rising consumption among many, in contrast to dire insufficiency, barely survivability among many others. And we are reaching critical resource limits, which all point to the urgent need for sufficiency, but also sufficiency that is appropriate to issues of equity and cultural differentiation. So the goal might be best said as being, how do we improve well-being of society through both sufficiency and efficiency? We need both of these, because if the system in which we hope to be sufficient is highly inefficient, we will not be able to restrict the use of the resources. So sufficiency is a subjective, a cultural, a contextual issue, whereas efficiency is broadly technological. One way to look at all this, to schematically indicate this, was drawn by Carolyn Zim when we put together the third report to the UN High-Level Political Forum in July of 2020. And it really emphasizes the idea of decent living standards, which is meant to mean that, number one, it is built on sufficiency and resource requirements, as you see in the bottom of this sort of pyramid, if you will, funnel. It deals with needs, abilities, and opportunities in the familiar presentation. But by focusing on decent living standards, that's an approach to dealing with the very different contexts and cultures in which this has to be enacted. But that's the point which gets difficult. How do we reach sufficiency without behavior change? We have to change behaviors to become sufficient. And what tools do we have to foster and guide behavior change? Well, we can push, we can give information, we can have dialogues, regulations, what you can and cannot do, or should not do. We can have persuasion, we can have the norms, which are the should. But we also have to avoid falling into the trap of the information deficit that's long been shown to be poorly effective at best. And the fact that we haven't even learned our own lesson of that is a pretty good indication of that. We still try to hand people knowledge and then expect them to make use of that. What we need is to find a way to really engage rather than teach or be didactic, and to reach even those who are not interested in sustainability per se, or to begin with. So what we can do is try to pull them into engagement, to motivate people to want to learn through their curiosity, active participation, and inquiry. And that one way to address that desire to pull people in, to engage them, is to build affective engagement, that is, pull on emotional issues, not only on cognitive, matters, cognitive processing, through narratives and narrative-driven games. Narratives, people are familiar with it, or it's used frequently as a term, but let me just be a little more specific. Yes, they have a story and they have characters and a scene, a context, but that context is crucial, and they have also a sense of orientation and a normative purpose. So they are not just the story, but they are why that story has meaning for the intended audience. Narratives are expressed in many forms, not just as long speeches or sermons or whatever, or literature written. It's dance, it's myths, it's storytelling, it's paintings, it's songs, it's drama. One category of narratives that has particularly interested me, particularly in the Knowledge Learning Societal Change Alliance that I've led for the last dozen years, now known as Classica, are narratives of social identities, which reflect and help maintain culture on one hand, and which also act as motivation, sort of provocation and motivation of actions in accord with the group with which that social identity is connected. It can be a group or a community of different forms, including online. So it's a kind of in-group versus the others, or us versus the others aspect to that. An example, foods as narratives of social identity, it caught my attention in the last issue of the EOS Science News from the American Geophysical Union. A quote, indigenous food knowledge network connects indigenous and non-indigenous scholars, community members, and leaders from the Alaskan and Canadian Arctic and subarctic and the US Southwest to co-produce food sovereignty solutions. And the quote that I found also very relevant from what we've been talking, it's not just something we physically eat, but it's part of our ceremonies. It's our connection to the land, to our non-human kin. So in that sense, it's an integral part. Food itself is an integral part of social identity. There are many other parts that are connected. The other important sort of category here with narratives is narratives of vision. And I'll take the example with foods. Narratives of vision provide a reason and an orientation for acting to move towards a particular future. For example, in the indigenous community of autonomous, post-colonial, thriving societies, maintaining culture. And a particular example, a friend and colleague of mine that I worked with the Arctic Council, working group on sustainable development, is Anders Oskal, who's director of the International Center for Reindeer Husbandry. And he uses and articulates very powerfully a narrative of vision of improving the well-being of Arctic peoples by maintaining the culture of foods across the Pan-Arctic region, drawing on these different cultural aspects, but with the common framework of the vision of becoming independent towards their own well-being as they use their cultural heritage. So where do narratives then what do they offer us? How can we use them in games? They are used in games. There are many narrative, role-playing, narrative-driven games. But just to take a couple of pieces of this a little further, a key element in drama of any sort is a particular kind of tension that holds the story together and the audience in that dramatic arc of tension, building, and resolving. The focus, though, in my view, in terms of using the narratives in a game, is not on the scene or the story broadly. Those, of course, are important, characters, etc., but specifically on the protagonist, who in a sense embodies and enacts the tension. And the narratives of vision, narratives of vision, are the driver for the protagonist seeking to bring change to a community or society, seeking to accomplish something. And that narrative of vision is what is, in a sense, driving the protagonist. Why the protagonist? Because that is with whom the observer, the player, the audience, whatever, becomes really engaged. It's not just about hearing something, but again, particularly if we're thinking about a game, becoming engaged because that vision of that protagonist is in question, is at risk as you engage in the game. At the same time, the protagonist is struggling with the constraints and, in some cases, the affordances of narratives of identity and social norms. So, who is the protagonist in the game is part of understanding, as a game player, something about that protagonist's identity in the context of the game, and dealing with what that provides the protagonist, but also how it constrains the protagonist. And the struggle then is to get to both, for the protagonist to overcome the barriers and the constraints to reach the vision that the protagonist has, and for the player to understand and make sense of the narratives of vision and of the identities, or identity that's dominant, of the protagonist, in order to be able to essentially take on the role of the protagonist successfully. So I would challenge us to embed meaningful narratives in games to improve the pull of games for sufficiency, efficiency, and ultimately sustainability. Will this help us slide willingly down the slope to sufficiency? I think it may. I think it could help with certain groups and maybe many, but it depends very much on how that is specifically crafted. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is very relevant talk responding to the keynote, I feel.
Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Niles, and on behalf of my colleague and co-author Abe Kenichi, I would like to thank the Feast Project for inviting us to participate in this symposium. We want to follow some of the main themes that have been raised so far, and in particular the need to shift away from the conventional narratives in sustainability and agricultural sustainability and focus on already existing alternatives. And especially we want to bring attention to the cultural fields and the cultural values that surround alternative agricultural endeavors. And so our title is The Cultural Dimensions of Agricultural Sustainability. Here we go. Hello, my name is Daniel Niles, and on behalf of my colleague Abe Kenichi, I'd like to present our paper, The Cultural Dimensions of Agricultural Sustainability. Well, here we would like to ask, from what field of human experience could sustainability arise? What human history offers clues, forms, and perhaps even tangible examples of mutually beneficial, longer-term interaction between human societies and environments? Well, we would like to suggest that traditional agriculture can provide important insight into these questions, and that the key to long-term sustainable agri-food systems lies in the cultural realm. And yet it's rare that traditional agriculture or the cultural field surrounding it is considered actionable in relationship to contemporary social and ecological problems. Well, quickly, just a little bit about who we are. Well, we're coming to you from the Research Institute for Humanity and Nature in Japan. Japan, a country with lots of very interesting evidence of long-term cultural ecological continuity. Our institute also has, from its inception nearly 20 years ago, taken a cultural approach to the study of environment and environmental problems. And this means that the solutions that we seek must be relevant in the cultural realm, and therefore must also engage with human values. So our scientific practice, in order to do this, must recognize and address different ways of living in nature and different views of nature itself. This is because ideas of nature are foundational to a people's sense of self. We have this quote from Niculescu: "Once formed, an image of nature exercises an influence on all areas of knowledge." That's to say that ideas of nature are embedded in and expressed through social practices of all different kind, and we find agriculture as a perfect example, a kind of a translation and an instantiation of people's understandings of the forces of the natural world, of the forces that create their place. And here is a very succinct passage written by Philippe Descola on this exact phenomenon. I don't read it to you now in order to conserve time, but I invite you to come back once the presentation is posted up online so that you can read it in full. Meanwhile, the question of agricultural sustainability is most often and most powerfully discussed, or most influentially discussed, as a technical challenge, which for some decades has really been framed by the concern to increase yields and calories while minimizing the ecological impacts of agricultural production. And so what this seems indicative of is a kind of imaginary that is dominated by powerful inherited tropes. And one of these that we think is really important is the belief in the critical novelty of contemporary sustainability challenges, that our challenges today are fundamentally different from those of previous times and peoples, and the consequent belief in the need to change current practices, which is certainly true in some realms, especially when we consider consumption in the wealthy world. But the phenomenon of change has become itself the kind of central concern. And in the current agricultural system, in the context of current agricultural systems, the most effective change mechanisms are seen to be those that essentially can green around the edges of the conventional patterns of production. And so these type of programs that you see on the right keep popping up and have always, it seemed to me, been of relatively questionable merit. But what we really want to get into here is that this focus on change means at the same time that the dynamics concerning or the dynamics surrounding cultural ecological persistence over long periods of time are largely ignored. Instead, there has been the practice of borrowing into conventional agricultural systems the practices or concepts of traditional agriculture And this might seem like a relatively benign process especially from the perspective of industrial agriculture, but from the perspective of the traditional agricultural systems themselves, it ends up amounting to essentially an appropriation of traditional knowledge. And this has been discussed, of course, by many people. But here we really, what seems relevant is that not only is a kind of appropriation of traditional knowledge, but also it amounts to a kind of impoverishment of the sustainability imaginary, in the sense that there's a kind of plug and play mentality that's brought to the Earth system, rather than a much more deep engagement with the kind of contextual and relational dimensions that have created really long-term sustainable, we can say, agricultural systems in different places around the world. And in particular, one of the functions of that is that traditional agriculture might be interesting. The agroecology of traditional agriculture might be interesting to science or to sustainability, but the cultural dimensions, the cultural phenomena that surround them, that surround traditional agricultural systems, are most often kind of considered superfluous or extraneous or decorative, rather than generative in themselves of the knowledge of the ecologies that are also at the same time sustainable. Here, clearly we're arguing for the contrary. We believe that long-standing mutually beneficial interactions do exist and are even creative elements within what are often presented as the natural landscapes and ecological services whose conservation is of such concern today. These places and these complex co-evolved culture-nature phenomena provide some of humankind's best examples of cultural ecological sustainability. So our ideas in this field are informed by our experience working in and around the GIAS program of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. GIAS is globally important agricultural heritage systems. Neither of us is directly involved with the GIAS program any longer, but it's a very interesting. Our ideas in this field are informed by our involvement for several years in the FAO's GIAS program. GIAS is globally important agricultural heritage systems, and it's a relatively new program to the FAO. It's in some ways akin to UNESCO's World Cultural Heritage designation, except, of course, that here you're talking about living landscapes and real living communities. And so the frameworks, the conceptual framework and criteria are quite a bit different. The GIAS criteria focus on five key areas: food and livelihood security, agrobiodiversity, traditional knowledge and techniques, cultural values and collective forms of organization, and remarkable landscapes linked to management of water and land. And one of the key, I think, innovations of the GIAS program was to declare that each of these areas was are really only separated by a blurry line, that they're all actually co-constitutive and co-creative, that they're related to each other very, very, very closely, and that all of them must be, the interactions between all of them are the thing that creates the whole living, evolving system through time. And these are, it seems to me, oftentimes kind of written off as boutique agricultures, but on the contrary, it seems that these are actually present, some of these systems have survived for even millennia, and they seem to present really tangible examples of what sustainable agriculture can look like. In GIAS, you'll see there are a number of sites around the world. The bulk of them is in Asia, but they're also in other regions. Very quickly, I'll introduce one site that's found in Western Japan, in Kyushu, the Takachihogo Shivayama Mountainous Agriculture and Forestry System of Miyazaki. as you see in this map. Here you have a few snapshots of some kind of key features of the site. But here you get maybe the most succinct snapshot of the idea of small-scale, household-based, complex, mixed agricultural livelihood strategies. People work between the forest, between the fields, and between pastures, in husbandry, in cultivation and gathering of food crops, a very labor and knowledge-intensive set of practices, different households kind of with different degrees of specialization across those areas, but almost everybody working in a kind of, having kind of multiple livelihood strategies going on at once. Households usually control about 5 hectares of land, but there are important traditions of joint management of the forest, and also collective practices such as the construction and maintenance of mountain forest roads, and especially an impressive system of canals that brings water to upland communities. And what is also really notable here, and also in other GIAS areas, is the very rich field of symbolic value, or what are often called the kind of immaterial cultural elements, but perhaps could be better described as the kind of metaphysical realm of these particular sites. It's extremely present in this community, and seems to us to be one of the most important elements, perhaps even the most important element, as it is in these realms, these symbolic realms, these metaphysical realms, that one finds the ideas of nature articulated directly and linked directly also to behaviors or sets of behaviors or suites of activity, we can say, and which function as a kind of glue that pull what appear to be disparate elements of everyday life into a coherent whole. And it seems to us that understanding these relationships on their own terms, in terms of their own logic, in terms of their own forms, is a key intellectual challenge for us, the observers of these places. As I think that it can be said, at least it seems to me convincing, but at least it's provocative to say that more than anything else, it seems to us that cultural degradation, cultural decline, or loss of cultural coherence is the phenomenon that leads to ecological decline most certainly. And so our challenge is to understand the dynamic interactions between different realms of life that can be associated with the persistence of these places over long periods of time. And one way in which to do this is to see these places not in terms of their individual features, but instead as living knowledge systems that are characterized by overlapping elements that convey key meanings through both material and immaterial media and forms. And the circulation of these meanings acts to affirm the knowledge of the different realms of activity and keeps these different realms in dialogue. And in fact, it seems to us that many aesthetic experiences, the rituals, the feasts, and so on, are structured exactly to reveal these continuities running between what are normally considered or normally experienced as different activities of life, and which these experiences, which in essence demonstrate a people's knowledge of how to live here. My colleague Abe-san has spent much more time in this community than I have, and he wanted to stress also that the GIAS designation, this kind of holistic framework, is not the kind of the end of a process in the way that an UNESCO heritage sometimes can seem to be, but instead, at its best, can really be a tool for the local community to articulate the problems that they face, to think about where they are and what they have done and what they should do next. And though they face many of the same challenges that rural people around the world face, there have been some innovative actions within the GIAS communities. And in fact, at this moment is an endeavor in Japan to link up the different GIAS sites that exist in Japan. That is a talk for another time. But here we just conclude to say that our science is empirical and material and secular, and for the most part ignorant of the metaphysical. But these metaphysical realms correspond to people's understandings of the natural forces of the world around them, and so they have an ontological significance in the world. They are not optional, and they ought to be taken more forthrightly as critical elements and as real creative forces in the world. I'm sorry that I went over time slightly, but here are some references that inform this paper, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Daniel Niles. Interesting story and beautiful photos. Please make sure if you have any questions and comments, please post to the Slack channel. Okay, so now we move on to the third presentation from Ashley Colby, Rhizoma Field School in Uruguay.
Hello and welcome to my presentation. My name is Ashley Colby. I am PhD in environmental sociology from Washington State University, and now I live and work in Colonia, Uruguay, where I founded Rhizoma Field School. Today I'll be talking about a chapter from my book, Subsistence Agriculture in the U.S., which the topic is basically how I see practical activities within the environmental movement as leading to social change. Title of the chapter is Without the Garden, We Never Would Have Met Him, Practitioner Networks as a Post-Capitalist Double Movement Activity. So I rely on Morris Berman's dual process theory, which sort of very generally discusses how when systems fail, alternatives arise. So if a social system is failing to meet presented needs, people will seek out alternatives to meet those needs, and then those alternatives eventually coalesce to turn into the next system. So Berman argues that capitalism runs from 1500 to 2100, and we're in the last century of it. And in this last century, we'll see failures, institutional failures that force people to solve problems themselves, and then those solutions will lead to the next system. Here I have an example. Black beekeepers are transforming Detroit's vacant lots into bee farms. Here's an example of the vacant lots. No use, failure of the system, and some alternative use that people come up with to meet their needs. I define these alternatives as shadow structures, which is any individual or group social organization that adopts an alternative logic to that of late capitalism, meets presented needs, and exists parallel to, not in direct conflict with, the hegemonic industrial system. And I want to hammer this point home that this is not an explicitly political structure. It's not political in nature when it starts, and it is specifically developing as a very practical activity meant to meet needs as the system fails to meet those needs. I think a lot of times we think of social change only in this political realm, or only in terms of protest or those kinds of activities, and it's very explicitly not meant to bring down the system, but exists parallel to the system. The specific shadow structure I discuss in my book is subsistence food production, which I define as more than 50% of food needs in and around Chicago. I talk to urban, rural, and suburban people, but I argue at the end of this presentation that we can look at much more than subsistence food production. There's plenty of activities where this theory applies. I also rely on Eric Olin Wright's interstitial transformation theory, which he talks about the creative processes that get developed in the cracks and spaces of the dominant system of power. And he goes into a little bit more detail than Berman, so there's a sort of cycle of extension and social empowerment and stagnation, and successive limits are encountered and eroded. So the basic idea here is that these alternatives come about, then there's pushback from the hegemonic system, and then new creative workarounds happen, and it's this sort of ebb and flow process. It's not linear. I don't think I need to argue here that there are failures of the economic system, including the coronavirus, protests described here as blowing politicians' mind by slowly explaining that when people can't afford to live, they get mad, which is a simple explanation for, there's sort of seething anger at the failure of institutions and the failure to meet presented needs. Crisis of healthcare, crisis of unemployment, crisis of food distribution systems, to name a few. David Harvey's talked about how the crises of capitalism are baked into the system, insofar that as people, the larger population, upward transfer of wealth, the larger population doesn't have enough money to buy consumer goods, which then is the death knell for capitalism as it stops the economy from growing. And specifically related to industrial agriculture, here is an example of a graph. If you see corn, soybeans, and wheat, starting around the year 2013 or so, literally are negative yield, economic yield per acre. So they are only propped up by subsidies, and there are many different reasons that the industrial agriculture system cannot continue to exist, but this is one of the most glaring. The other, of course, is soil health and many others. So methods for my study, of course, I talked to subsistence food producers in 3 field sites. I did 60 semi-structured interviews, 100 plus hours of ethnography, and I basically went in with the question, why do people take part in this, and what resulted? So what I found is that subsistence food production starts out as an individualized activity. People want to do it for various reasons. The reasons are extremely diverse. The ideology behind doing it is extremely diverse. The activity itself is quite homogenous. People get a similar thing out of it, but they go into it for many different reasons, including distrust of the government, distrust of corporations, just a generalized feeling of alienation, and crisis and risk. But what happens is this individualized activity necessarily requires requires practitioners to reach out to others for help, and this is quite different from sustainable consumption, like buying organic food, which can stay as an individualized activity. Sustainable production necessarily requires a network of practitioners that people need to troubleshoot, people need to find materials, they need to source things, they need information and help on housing, on vegetable gardening, on so many things. So there are these sort of weak tie practitioner networks that extend beyond significant social barriers of geography, race, class, gender, and age. But more importantly, I would say that these practitioners connect despite their varying identities. So you can have sort of libertarian, NRA, conservative, connecting with sort of hardcore progressive city person, and they don't really have to talk about that identity or attitudinal or ideology. They can go straight to, pests on the chickens or sourcing feed. So what happens, I argue, is that we move from these sort of private solutions that meet presented needs to more public ones. So an example from my data of a political shadow structure, a social movement activity, is that when people in the people who were keeping chickens in Chicago were under attack from a council person who was trying to ban chicken keeping within the city limits, and basically they mobilized to stop this ban from happening. And the way they mobilized was also really interesting. They didn't protest, they didn't lobby. What they did was they created a chicken coop tour, which was an open tour of all the people who wanted to open their backyards to show their chicken coops to others. And basically what happened is showing their coops to others made connections with neighbors who are, also constituents of the city council person, and lowered the stigma, and it sort of built this strength in connection of normal people to one another. Another political activity they did to stop this ban from happening is they provided resources across their network on other cities' policies, and sharing that information horizontally armed the group to combat this attack, and eventually they were successful. I also argue that there are sort of economic shadow structures or alternative economic arrangements. Practitioners shared animal manure in exchange for vegetables, or too many animals produced in a city lot in a relationship with somebody with rural plot of land, sort of exchanging animals and animal products, sharing information, seeds, plans, chicken coops, animals, food products. And the more time I spend here in Uruguay, the more I realize that there are so many alternative economic arrangements that are just not measured. And I think if we're trying to think about social change in relation to food or to other economic arrangements beyond food, we have to keep in mind that there are these alternative economic arrangements that are not being measured, that can be very powerful and very positive. So the takeaway from the study, I would argue, is that practitioner networks allow for inclusive social movements. So there's not this ideological barrier. They can be mobilized to create new political, economic, and social structures, which I call shadow structures. And people rely on these new structures as the larger capitalist system fails. If they can't, if there's no food in the store, for example, people have these alternative economic arrangements. They know who has chickens and who has compost and who has a garden and who has eggs and who has things to share. There are some good news. There's raising a larger awareness of the food system, monopolies, supply chains, and there's more and more interest in local food, farmers selling direct to consumers. In Scandinavia, this is growing exponentially, but other places as well. People are questioning consumption and materialism. But if you don't take away anything else from my presentation today, I really want to highlight this slide. I'm going to take a couple minutes on this slide. So I think a lot of times we think of social change as the civil rights movement. We think of it, we have an ideological vision of what should happen and how that can happen via top-down change, via changing laws. But I would argue that the political project of today is overhauling the entire system. In trying to imagine an overhaul of the entire system, we get into an imaginary space that's almost impossible, even for people who are like complex systems theorists, because it's very hard to hold in your head at the same time all of the different parameters of change and how those might play out in the real world and all the cascading consequences of this. So I would also argue that staying in this imaginary space, trying to imagine the next world and then implementing it, it's really just impractical, because any imagination that you would come up with for an alternative system isn't field tested. And so trying to imagine the perfect system first before trying to enact to me seems it's kind of a spinning our wheels in trying to get the system that we actually want to see happen to actually happen. I would also argue that many of these ideas can be confusing or alienating or very elite. Even amongst environmental sociologists or environmentalists more generally, there's disagreement about which of these systems between degrowth and donut economics and the circular economy and solidarity economies would work. And I would argue that all of the jargon that comes along with the imagination of many of these ideas can be very alienating for normal people, and it makes it a very strong barrier to entry for a lot of people, and makes this movement stay in this sort of elite environmentalist space. Environmentalists tend to be, white, urban, liberal, highly educated. And I would argue that we need to have a more inclusive movement, and the way we can do that is learning from the practitioners in my study, by field testing our ideas. And field testing specific ideas or multiple specific ideas has so many benefits, and and as I've learned from the data in my study, it not only strengthens the idea by testing it in the real world against real conditions, it also shows, not tells, other people how this idea is possible, not only possible but beneficial. If people see it and experience it, I was at so many of the chicken coop tour moments, aha moments, where people were coming and seeing the chicken coops and having this aha moment, like, wow, this is really great, actually. Whereas if you sit down at a kitchen table with them and tell them about how chicken coops are great, it's a little bit more alienating of a conversation. So show, not tell. It becomes a meaningful activity for the practitioner, one that they're willing to defend, as was shown in the study. It's easier to make community connection over shared behavior than these ideas. You know, like imagine going to a degrowth meeting. You have to have like a college degree or a large exposure to the kind of degrowth jargon that's used to participate meaningfully in those activities, whereas to go and just have a conversation about chickens, a very, very low barrier to entry. And then these communities of practice, once they get going, are quite resilient. And I also found that people innovated beyond the initial connection that they made. So that maybe they made a connection about chicken coops, but then they saw that the person was also keeping honey, or keeping bees for honey, and they asked about that. And now the person's into honey and chicken keeping. So it's this sort of virtuous cycle, I would argue. Finally, I just want to briefly say that beyond subsistence food production, there's plenty of other practical activities that I've come across and get behind, in terms of, not that these things are all perfect, but they're things that we can start field testing now. Planting perennials basically everywhere, chickens anywhere that there's low density, holistically grazing, livestock, including poultry, but also ruminants in public parks, cemeteries, sports field, parkways, gray water gardens, passive solar water heaters, eco bricks, which are just basically empty water bottles that you put plastic waste into, and then you can build with those. Construction, either new or retrofitted, with passive solar principles, permeable pavers, clotheslines, cooperatives, sharings, and swaps. Solar ovens, buy local, selling local, and part of this informal economy, compost toilet, and incorporating any of the above into education is really key. So the questions I have for discussion: will this crisis lead to further exploration of alternatives? Are shadow structures developing? Do you agree with me? What critiques do you have of this theory? What will persist? And I'm happy to discuss all of that. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Ashwin. Again, we listened the same interest, how to say? Well, more and more I convinced that we share something together. Now we move to the last presentation of this session. I think it is our honor to be able to invite Raja Chanduri as a presenter, because he is the fiction writer by his profession. It is appropriate speaker to be the symposium named as the Stories from Post-Growth Future, isn't it? Okay, so let's get started.
A very good day, good evening, good afternoon to all of you. I'd like to thank RIHN for organizing this extremely important event. In 2018, I had published a science fiction novel called The Butterfly Effect about an illegally released genetically modified rice affecting the health of millions in the backdrop of climate disasters. Perhaps the bad karma of taking my readers on an albeit entertaining trip through dystopia that hung heavy on my shoulders was somewhat cleansed thanks to the opportunity provided later by RIHN and World Weaver Press to work on an anthology of solar punk stories from Asia Pacific themed multi-species cities. Today I will try to explore other stories and other cultures that challenge the dominance of the modes of production, distribution, and consumption of food. So I am going to do it in 3 or 4 sections. First, I will touch a bit upon Tolstoy's famous story, How Much Land Does a Man Need? Then I will move on to advantages, needs, uses, and impacts of eco-fiction or climate fiction, which are closely allied to food stories. Then I'll try to storyfy one or two examples, real-life examples of alternative food cultures, and then finally close with a few tips about story writing. How Much Land Does a Man Need is Lev Tolstoy's well-known story about a greedy peasant who is offered as much land as he can circle in a day by the nomadic Bashkirs. With mounting greed, he goes on farther and farther for a little more, but fails to make it to the starting point before sundown, falling dead right at the finishing line. This is a classic fable of greed, punishment, and in case of people and the planet, unsustainable living. The creamy, white, and aromatic Radha Tilak rice is said to be a favorite of Radha, the divine consort of Hindu deity Krishna. It is also a folk variety which has survived the assault of high-yielding seeds. Such simple produce-related stories easily resonate with many consumers, helping them make a choice. There is the well-known anecdote of the conference found in Storytelling for Sustainability in Higher Education, where years later people remembered stories about the subject they had told each other while not clearly remembering people's names or affiliations. Clearly, the appeal, emotional connect, and recall value of stories can be hardly overemphasized. Stories simplify the message, besides acting as glue between practitioners, activists, storytellers, consumers, and producers. Stories help imagine possible futures and make scenarios and pathways meaningful to planners, among others. The gap between reader, listener, and actor can be bridged by a story. Also, stories can be vehicles to communicate sustainability goals, production and consumption flows, and change in attitudes and behaviors at individual and societal levels. Nick Admussen, in his 6 proposals for the reform of literature in the age of climate change, have called for stories that do away with progress-based narratives, retire the portrait of the single soul, and to stop yelling over biomes. He also asks us to choose systems over objects, and his proposals stress on practical ethics against personal ambition of the storyteller-writer, while also emphasizing on the urgency of the poor to speak for herself and not through us. Most of these are also relevant for stories envisioning futures. Two studies led by Matthew Schneider-Meyerson, and these studies were conducted on climate fiction readers, found that younger, more liberal, and more climate-concerned people, among which are many millennials, read more of these stories. This study also noted dramatic emotional responses and that these stories help readers imagine potential futures. Also, progressives as against conservatives were found more likely to be nudged by climate fiction from their cautious to concerned position or from concern to alarm vis-a-vis climate change. They also uncovered the importance of repeated readings without which effects of these stories wash away, and the focus of the story world on particular problems, say drought versus flooding, was found to color the beliefs of the readers of climate change fiction. Another story that connects us with the ingredient and can help conservation efforts. These are my rice selfies of a variety called kalo bhat or black rice from Bengal, and on the top left is a traditional sweet rice pudding called paesh I made with it. This folk rice variety is sourced from a conservation-linked business called Amar Khamar. It is said Chinese noblemen grew this rice for themselves and common people were not allowed to use it, so the name forbidden rice. So now we present glimpses of and experiments with alternatives before moving on to storyfying one of these. Edible Archives is a sustainable food restaurant in Goa run by Onumitra Ghosh Pustidar and Shalini Krishan. I was aware about the initiative from friends and media reports and interviewed them to dig out their story. More about them soon. Next comes Debal Dev's work with conservation of folk varieties of rice through farms and organizations like Boshuda and Brihi. He has made useful interventions in conserving more than 1,000 landraces with specialized nutritional, climate tolerance, and other profiles. Another area of alternative food cultures and informal practices which could lend to inspiring stories is in scarcity-driven practices that were sometimes mainstreamed. For example, diets consisting of kochushak taro, muri, puffed rice, googly snails were not invented during the Bengal famine of 1943 but linked to it also rationing, and the famine made roti, which is a wheat flatbread, popular in Bengal. Previously it was only rice. Again, the use of flower petals, vegetable skin cooking are also famine-era practices that have been sustained. For these, see Aditi Sen's Bengal Famine and Thakuma's Kitchen in Mint and Sharanya Dipak's A Forgotten Holocaust in Atlas Obscura. During the COVID lockdown, Anumitra of Edible Archives, and I'm sure many others, discovered that sweet potato leaves as well as spinach, stems and roots, which were easily available, can provide essential nutrition to their teams and neighbors. Let us now look at the nuts and bolts of a simple story. The story has a plot which is basically the dynamics of goals, motivations, obstacles, and resolution. Also, a story has characters and settings. Here is one way of introducing a character. The stranger came in February, one wintry day, through a biting wind and a driving snow, the last snowfall of the year, over the down, walking from Bramblehurst railway station and carrying a little black portmanteau in his thickly gloved hand. He was wrapped up from head to foot, and the brim of his soft felt hat hid every inch of his face but the shiny tip of his nose. So you introduce a character like this. This is Invisible Man. Similarly, we can begin with the stranger appeared in the flooded village of Sundarbans in a leaking boat a few weeks after Cyclone Aila's death dance. The signs of devastation were all around. He had a weather-bitten face, a slow, purposeful gait, and fiery eyes that gleamed with otherworldly light in the lightning flashes of another approaching storm. He listened carefully to their stories. People washed away, the broken embankment, and about the storm surge which had sent salty water deep into their croplands. What will they survive on? For the fields which fed them were as good as dead, the soil poisoned by the curse of the salt. Now that the obstacle or the story conflict has been introduced, the story conflict is the curse of the salt. We can take our plot to tell the story of Lal Getu, Nona Bokra, Tal Mugur, all salinity-tolerant folk varieties of rice brought to the village by the stranger scientist and conservator Debal Deb, a real person, of course, which helped the villagers claw back towards food security in the face of the cyclone and climate disaster. So let us now try and tell a story similar to the one we experimented with just now. A story using some of the inputs gathered from Anumitra of Edible Archives restaurant using the elements and methods mentioned before. These are various varieties of rice, as you can see. Who is and are the main characters here? Anumitra the chef, Shalini who takes care of the farm, a Thai chef who is kind of a secret guardian. Similarly, the scientist is our main character in the previous story. Let's focus on Chef Anumitra and see how she carries the plot. For our purpose, to understand a character better, we can use character bios. We ask, is she fun, affable, serious, academic, hardworking, energetic, romantic, team worker, nasty? What kind of work does she do? What is her family background? These are all questions we ask about a character. We can have a character outline in this case like friendly, warm-hearted bibliophile and a PhD in cognitive linguistics who always wanted to be a chef. Her Bengali upbringing introduced her to a vast repertoire of cooking ingredients. This is Anumitra's real life story. So a tip in fashioning characters is to know your audience and use familiar, identifiable characters for better connect whenever possible. Which brings us to setting. Where and when do your characters live? Where does she become who she is? Where does Anumitra live and work? What's special about this or these places? What are the problems peculiar to this setting? We can begin with the setting of her studies when PhD Blues drove her to try and get work at Tamura-san's Japanese restaurant in Delhi, which is where she says she learned a lot. From there, she moves on to opening takeaways and eateries like Bento Bong and the Big Bong and working with celebrity chef Ritu Dalmia at Diva, all part of a growing awareness about local sourcing. But always try to tell a story close to a major turning point. Here it happens in Anumitra's case. She was working in a Thai restaurant, and that is where you can begin your story. What's special about this Thai restaurant? Is it pretty, windy? Describe that place a bit. It might be that this place has a problem of its own that drives the plot forward, but in our case, in Anumitra's case, it was a question asked by the Thai chef at the restaurant. One day he brings 3 green coconuts for her to taste and asks her to tell him which one came from near the sea, which from near the river, and which from near a lake. This question triggered many ideas that were floating about in her mind for years. Questions of food and where it comes from, food miles, conservation of seeds, and so on. This, coupled with her background, will finally drive her towards sustainable food and the stories surrounding food. But this is revealed later. For now, let us look at goals. Related to motivation and closely connected with your character are the goals. Motivation sets you off on the journey, the goals at the end of the journey. Sometimes broader goals are in the background of what we do, but they always fuel our story. In Anumitra's case, the immediate goals would be reducing waste, reducing emissions, local sourcing, conservation, green consumption, and the broader goals, sustainability, SDGs, and so on. So a tip here is write down your core message and create your story around that, or begin with engaging story starters. Which takes us to obstacles. All these pictures are from Edible Archives in these slides. The goals and motivations lead her to participate in a major exhibition and finally set up Edible Archives with Shalini, but obstacles are on the way. The story is still not over. Without obstacles, crisis, conflict, problems, there is no story. In her journey of locally sourcing ingredients and serving sustainable meals that come with a story, she faces obstacles like disbelief among consumers, customers, who say the stories of folk varieties of rice are untrue. She notices restaurants marketing imported salmon dishes in the midst of COVID lockdowns. The pervasiveness of the high consumption culture and low awareness about alternatives leads to disillusionment. She also notices customers asking for sushi, but she is not prepared to use a Californian rice variety that is used for sushi in her country. So, obstacles, obstacles, obstacles. What is the road to resolution? Finally, the plots of our stories are resolved when we achieve our immediate or long-term goals. Anumitra, through her allied farmers groups, discovers a rice variety from northeastern India, Nagaland, whose starchiness, texture, and other features closely resemble rice used for sushi. She rustles up a pumpkin-based sushi with this sticky rice, which is an immediate hit, saving many food miles. Visitors love to hear her stories about these dishes, the local ingredients used. They visit the farm, get to know how they compost all their waste, while she plans new ways and means to make sustainable food fashionable, interesting, and part of mainstream culture. Many of our own projects are still on the road to resolution. The goals are still to be achieved. Describe the conflicts, the journey. How far have we come? Then we have the 7 basic plots. Also, we have the 7 basic plots. It has been argued that all plots can be boiled down to these 7 basic storylines or more elaborately into 36 dramatic situations. But all said and done, in our stories we will need characters, settings, conflicts, motivations, goals, and resolutions, which may have been reached or not. While basic plots can be innovatively used to tell stories of better food futures, there are other typologies of plots borrowed from Cli-Fi, which can be helpful in approaching stories of sustainable food futures. Thus, the sphere imaginary of Gregor Anderson's typology. Many solar punk narratives, mitigative versus adaptive scenarios described by Jeffrey Barber, tech-heavy versus cooperation-heavy plots, among others, can be employed to write engaging food stories. Then again, I have tried to do a typology of near future food stories here. Next slide. Stories and narratives like video games, YouTube, etc., of positive sustainable food scenarios can also be categorized as those hinging on producer actors like Edible Archives, Kira Karai, Amar Khamar, etc., consumer actors like famine, COVID-related innovations, influencer actors, a positive spin on mukbang videos of online eating to promote sustainable food maybe, Debol Dev's work, Kent, a Naga person's food blogs, video blogs, or some of these which blurred these lines. So there are various other ways, and this is another way that I've tried to categorize food stories, stories about sustainable food, and ways these stories can be told. Producer and ingredient related stories, example for varieties of rice, can influence the wavering consumer who is otherwise easily swayed by aspirational buying and marketing. Like that Radha Tilak variety story I told you about, the Radha Tilak. Finally, some tools for storytelling which are commonly taught in writing classes but could be of help for us too, like POV, point of view. Will you tell your story in the first person or the third? Where you, the storyteller, is like an omniscient narrator. First-person stories can often easily engage the audience. Also, good stories are told by describing, which is called showing, important incidents through scenes instead of bland narration or telling. Finally, among various ways that a story can end, the crystal ball ending might be well suited for some of the stories we as activists are going to tell, where we take a leap into the future to see how things stand 10, 20, or 30 years from now. Remember Hunchback of Notre Dame, that scene, that last scene. So whatever be our capacities, let us imagine and work for a sustainable food future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wonderful and very imaginative talk. I can't stop thinking about which types of plot may be applicable to my field stories. So now we are moving to the discussion time. Well, thank you for posting many questions and comments to the journal. I would like to start from the question from Hein Malay to the Ilan Chubey and Rajat Chaduri. Hein, can you talk?
Yes, thank you. For me, there were obvious parallels between Ilan's story about narratives and Rajat's narrative about stories. It was very sort of illuminating to me to hear about characters, protagonists, and later on also about plot types and all that. At the same time, I myself tend to use the word narrative and sometimes story also in a more general abstract way. I remember long ago I had a small epiphany when I was looking at a table with numbers in it and realized that every table actually hides a story as well. The way it's organized, the way the categories are defined, the way ranges of numbers are delimited, etc., actually is a way of presenting the reality in a certain way, and a different organization of the table presents reality in a different way. So I think there are also underlying narratives or stories that may not have clear protagonists and characters that explain why things are the way they are, or why they're desirable or not desirable, etc., etc. I was wondering if Ilan and maybe Rajat can comment on this.
If I may, I'll jump in and would love to hear Rajat's comments also. what you're referring to, particularly with the idea of data, table, and so forth, I think is quite important in our remembering the fact that science itself is normative and is part of a narrative that we tell ourselves about what we do as far as doing science. And the data does not speak to us. We tell stories about the data, whether it's in a table or it's in a set of anecdotes even. So it is very much a part of a storytelling. And the narrative aspect is that we imbue it with certain significance, with meaning, and not just as, you know, this is the data, but we embed it in our view of what this research or information is, what is significant about it. Another point that I'd like to make that also, I mean, I thought that Rajat's talk was absolutely beautiful. It was fascinating and beautiful, and really illuminates the different ways and different places where one can make tangible, if you will, or perceptible these kinds of narratives. And your question, Hein, about, if you will, what you might call the ghost narratives, the narratives about things that are more abstract and abstruse. I think that's very important, but I think they are also quite amenable to embedding in stories, and Rajat is far better able to address that than I. But I do think that those can be made evident through the impact of those narratives on the protagonist or on the characters more broadly. So there are ways, I think, that one can directly address that. Thank you.
Rajat, how about you?
Yeah, thank you. Hein, a very interesting question actually, and it sets me thinking about the novel of ideas. You know, I was mostly talking about storytelling from the perspective of writing class maybe, but there is this thing called the novel of ideas, which can some way fit with what you are saying about abstract ideas. People, protagonists can be vehicles for abstract ideas in something called the novel of ideas, which can also be boiled down into short story or even at the anecdotal level. So that is one way of thinking. Another thought that is coming to my mind is about walking inside a story, participating in a culture, getting immersed in a culture. That is actually a kind of storytelling to oneself. When you visit a village in the forest and study that culture, live with the people, it is also a kind of story that you're telling yourself, letting the people there tell a story to yourself, and through that, very abstract ideas can be imbued, can be understood also. So these are two very simple ways that I can approach or engage with what you are saying. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you.
Thank you. So then I would like to move to the discussion about the agricultural side. So the Gregory Achaoli, can you talk? He's asking the very big question to Daniel Niles. Maybe it is difficult. I will read his question on behalf of him. He's asking about the function of the gears, and he's expressing his concern or the idea about the sorry. I thought yes. Yes, here I found that in the end. So the larger issue is this is how hesitation as a process tends to transform local knowledge system and bring in the hierarchical ranking of valuation that can further marginalize those systems that are not so recognized. I think it is a very important question. Daniel, can you reply about this question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Hi, thank you. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks for the question. And it's I see the problematic, and I think that there are examples, and certainly in the UNESCO World Cultural Heritage designation, in which the place becomes essentialized and essentially kind of held up as a kind of a mummy. There was a researcher at RIHN some years ago who used to talk about landscape mummies, and one particular site here in Japan, and these places in which kind of the idea is kind of to freeze time. And keep a kind of nostalgic view of heritage, and the same critique can kind of be levered at GIA sites, but in my perspective so far, that's not that's kind of more of an academic concern, I think, in the current state or in the current moment, because these sites are so few and so small in and of themselves, and also within the massive institution of the FAO, that they don't have really that much power, that much pull. There's still these tiny little examples, and they're, in my view, kind of one of the best attempts so far in the international institutions to kind of take a much more integrated cultural ecological approach to the question of conservation and development. And in that sense, they seem a step forward, which is not to say that they're perfect or that they can't be misused in other places, but I am interested, at least in these cases, to think about the positive that they can offer practically and intellectually, and their possibility, the potential that they have to kind of begin to reframe the discourses around who created all of these conservation values that are of such interest to us today. Because in many cases, as we all know already, it's the action of people over long periods of time that have created the forests that now we want to preserve, for all of their kind of formal ecological services that it provide. And in that sense, the products or the places, the peoples, have been just kind of systematically undervalued. And so I think this is a way to kind of begin to turn that table a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I agree with you. Well, on the one hand, the designation of the heritage system is a kind of the tools of narrative or tools of the story, how to tell the story of in rural areas. So it is very relevant to the Ian's talk, I feel. So unfortunately, actually, Colby texted us like she needs to go attend the crying baby. Wow, it's a very big duty. So I would like to move to the question from Natalino Cesar de Silva. Natalino?
Yes. Hello. Hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, what exactly as I write in the Slack? Yeah, I just check it again. So, what is the best monitoring system and management control that apply to the rural areas in order to ensure the right of the consumer and the right of the environment itself? That's my question. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalino. I think they're muted. They're having some issues back there. Does anybody from the session have an answer for Natalino? Perhaps if Ashley is run off, maybe Daniel on agriculture? Perhaps you could take it in the context of the GIA sites.
What are the best monitoring systems for social and ecological sustainability? I think that's the question. Yeah, this is a big problem. There are definitely kind of different toolkits out there. Most of them, of course, are very quantitative. And honestly, I'm really not the one to answer this question, because I've been much more interested in the knowledge dimensions of these places for some years. But I do know that Bioversity International has an interesting toolkit that they developed in relationship to the Satoyama initiative at the United Nations University. And that certainly begins to get at, it's very much kind of oriented to the international policy frameworks and discourses. So these days pointed towards the SDGs. And that's not bad, but I still believe that the SDGs and a lot of the quantitative frameworks, they can measure what they measure, but then the things that they can't measure, they just can't measure at all. And so in that sense, I think we're still really in search of conceptual approaches that allow us to get at the kind of deeper cultural dynamics that are associated with those much more measurable quantitative values. So I'm sorry that I can't give you a better answer than that, but
thanks, Daniel. Yeah.
Can I put a word in here?
Go ahead. Go ahead, Elon.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Just to say that what Daniel just said, to reinforce that or take it a step further, there are a lot of efforts that look at integrated assessment modeling and look at agricultural issues as part of that. Excuse me. But the problem often is, and it's beginning to be recognized in some of the circles that really work hard on this integrated assessment modeling, is that this kind of quantitative measures of the social adaptation are inadequate and in many ways ask the wrong questions. So I would say that there is a slowly developing greater awareness of the need of what Natalino is asking about the monitoring. But the monitoring has to become more than a sort of a tick the boxes of integrated assessment modeling. And indeed, the modeling itself has to become able to bring in also qualitative data. It is a difficult task and to some degree relies on agent-based modeling, for example, but there are other fuzzy cognitive mapping and so forth. But there are efforts now internationally. I'm aware particularly of the work at Stockholm Resilience Center and the IASA on the World in 2050 efforts around this, but I think they are parallel to many others. Yeah, I hope that's maybe helpful.
Thank you very much. So I would like to take the last question from Zoom, the Jeffrey Barber. Jeffrey Berber, can you hear me? Can you talk?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay, I'll just read it. In imagining, in terms of what kind of examples are out there in popular culture for the broader public, imagining the future, imagining sustainable food futures, we can imagine, and there, you could see these stories where there's economic collapse and people are trying to grow their own food and struggling that way. So a lot of the more self-sufficient kinds of scenarios are there and more available. But I'm wondering what kinds of examples in popular culture are there, imagining the future in terms of successful local struggles against this, this global agro-industrial food system.
Thank you. I think this
is a good example.
Thank you. I think this is a question for Rajat. Can you reply?
Yeah. Hi, Jeff. Nice to see you here. I'm really not aware of any novel or story about pushing back against for the industrial food culture. Maybe you'd know, but one or two stories that do come to mind, these are on the other side, like these are more darker. One would be my own novel, which is about a genetically modified rice variety crossing boundaries. And then, of course, there is, someone has already written about it, Bassi Galupi's novel, Wind Up Girl, where there is a lot of corruption in a future Thailand, and a GM company, GM corporates are trying to push in various kinds of genetically modified products. And the Environment Ministry and Trade Ministry are involved in that. And it's a very interesting novel, which does touch upon those issues, but I'm not really aware about a novel or a story or a fable maybe where people are coming together to push back against this kind of aggression of the corporates, if I may. Thank you.
Yeah, if I can step in real quickly, because I just wanted to mention, piggybacking in on this question by Jeffrey, in the general discussion chat or the channel there in Slack for the symposium, there was a discussion a bit about this. And so we were thinking a bit about this. And I think another example that it's not essentially a story about folks that are going against sort of mainstream or industrial agriculture, but preparing for the collapse and then sort of waiting for the collapse to happen and sort of unleashing their sustainable sort of way of producing food and living is in the Margaret Atwood trilogy, the Mad Adam trilogy. Take a look, maybe that's one that's out there that at least for me, I felt that was one of the closest ones. There's not a lot of kind of major stories out there that deal specifically with food. You know, food is sort of integrated into a bunch of my things. So, but that's a good question to think about. That's just what I had to say to sort of piggyback.
Thank you. So the interesting, yes, we also put the link about the writing food fiction into the channel. As all we listen through the keynote and discussion, narratives or stories can empower people to struggle and empower people to envision the new future. So it should be a good way to utilize fiction, the power of fiction. Okay, the interesting discussion is keep going, but now we are a bit running over the time. So I would like to close the session for now. Thank you again for all 4 presenters. And we would like to move on to the final session. I will hand the chair role to the Stephen McGreevy.
Great, thank you so much, Norie. Thank you everybody for sticking with us through the technical glitches there. So we're just entering into the final session. And what we'd like to do in this session with the remaining time, we don't have much time, is to get a couple of comments, general comments about the entire symposium from two speakers and have a bit of a discussion about that. So the first is Sato Yuichiro, who's based at Kyoto Prefectural University. And he's also the ex-deputy director general of RIHN. He's been doing a research on genetics of rice and a number of different issues around food and food ethics. So Max, if you would show us his comments. Thank you.
はい。はい。My name is Yoichiro Sato, one of the alumni of Research Institute for Humanity and Nature. Humanity and Nature, Research Institute for Humanity and Nature. You may know Chikyuken. So after that, I used the word Chikyuken. I'm very honored to be invited for final session of the symposium. First of all, I sincerely congratulate on the success of this symposium. This time, due to the pandemic of the coronavirus, COVID-19, the event could not be held normally, and organizers faced great difficulties. Without the devoted effort of the organizers and all the RIHN staff, the member of the FEAST project led by Stephen McGrady, this symposium would not have been successful. I remember the atmosphere of RIHN Chikyuken about 15 years ago. At that time, food and agriculture issues were not recognized to be global environmental issues. The problem of agriculture was recognized as the problem of water, and it was thought that solving the problem of water would solve the problem of food and agriculture. In 2006, fortunately, I could start a research project entitled Agriculture and Environmental Interactions in Eurasia, Past, Present, and Future, a 10,000 years history. But I had a lot of difficulties to get comprehension at that time as well. However, the food issue, including production, transportation, and processing, and consumption, is a common problem for all humankinds, of which all 7 billion people in the world are involved, and its solution would lead to the solution of global environmental problems. As Stephen mentioned at the morning session on 13th, food issues are related to most of the 10 issues of the planetary boundaries. 15 years passed, and 15 years have passed since then, and I'm very much surprised to know that a big change, and delighted that RIHN has started a FEAST project centered on food and agriculture of humans. All the keywords appeared in the present symposium. The one that impressed me was a narrative. Researchers try to explain their fruit to society with the word fact, or in Japan now with the word evidence. This word is very popular in Japanese society, not only scientific society, but common society too. But that attempts were not always successful. One of the reasons is that confidence in scientists or science communities is declining. A good example is prominent in dealing with the present pandemics of COVID-19. Another reason is that people tend not to ask what is favorite for them and ignore the ones that are not favorite for them. This has become prominent in the American society now, at the present U.S. presidential election. The science community must think more seriously about how their research result can be delivered to common society. Instead of scientific explanation that appeals to reason, there is a need for a method that directly appeals to emotion and leads to action. Narratives, especially those that have been handed down from old times, have been selected by society and have survived to this day and have a power to resonate with people and encourage their actions. I remember Ilan Chabai. He, if my memory is correct, a member of IASS, Institute for Advanced Sustainability Science in Potsdam. I hope my understanding is correct. And Ilan Chabai is the first researcher at Chikyuken who emphasizes narrative, a tool that plays a major role in the social implementation of research results. Utilization of humanities, including narratives, is extremely important for disseminating the result of the FEAST project. Chikyuken belongs to NIFU, National Institute for Humanities, which aims at the integration of humanities and the common happiness of humankind. Further, strengthening of cooperation with 5 NIFU organizations such as Nichibunken, Minpaku, Reikihaku, Kokugoken, and Kokubunken will exert great power in implementing the result of FEAST project in society. Professor Narifumi Tachimoto, the second Director General of Chikyuken, and later he becomes the president of NIFU, said, recently, scientists are looking for ways to convey the result of the research to a general public in an easy to understanding manner, such as science communications. However, it is unilateral communication and it ends in and does not solve the problem. The problem cannot be solved unless it is co-created through bilateral or interactive communications. The responsibility for making ethics inherent in science lies with the common people, including scientists. The problems cannot be solved unless it is co-created through interactive communication. The responsibility for immanent ethics in science must be taken by the common people, including scientists. We have to wait for future evaluations to see how far FEAST has been able to meet this expectation, but at least I would like to write down the achievement, good achievement that allows us this. In session 4, Chaudhary mentioned about Tolstoy's short story, How Much Land Does a Man Need? There are several stories in Japan that are similar to Tolstoy's story. In Japan, the background of the story is the idea of poetic justice. The word poetic justice is difficult for understanding for people all over the world, but in Japanese people say this is kanzen choaku. I don't have enough time to explain all, but anyway, it's a kind of poetic justice. Ryunosuke Akutagawa's story, this is very famous in Japan, and younger people knows that when they are in the school children, the spider's thread. Spider's thread is one of them. The main character, Kandata, who was in hell, finds a spider's thread to reach heaven, which Buddha has extended for the one good deed he did during his lifetime. Anyway, Kandata did only one good thing during his lifetime, and Kandata climbs up When it is about to reach heaven, Kandata finds many sinners hanging on the thread. Astonished, Kandata tries to shake them off, but immediately the thread breaks and Kandata falls into the hell with other sinners. The weakness that occurs in the heart of Kandata and the weakness that occurs in the heart of Pahom are not completely the same. But what the two stories tell about the future food of mankind has something in common. It seems necessary to urgently discover the stories that have been handed down in various places and different human cultures and to develop the revised modern version to the story. In Japanese society, the idea of poetic justice still lives on in the heart of a younger generation, and not only elderly people. I'm not necessarily in favor of the idea of poetic justice because it has an anarchist side. But perhaps for the younger generation, in a desperate situation where politics and sciences are not unreliable, personal judgment and traditional ideas may be the last criterion to rely on. Let me talk about the late Dr. Toshitaka Hidaka, who was first Director General of Chikyuken. Hidaka-san defines global environmental problems as the problems of human culture in the broadest sense. This definition was controversial when Hidaka-san launched the Chikyuken, but it is now widely accepted. The problems of food in the agriculture is also understood as a problem of human culture, both in terms of production and consumption, and also in terms of culture in a narrow sense of both sides. Perhaps this story was talked by Daniel and Abe, so you can refer them. Another great idea for Hidaka-san was that discovery that animals are tools. The essence of his idea is appeared in a figure on the back cover of the project, which is a deformed version of the human digestive system. Hidaka-san emphasized the importance of animals and the plants, including humans, connected to others through the food chain or food web. He argued that an understanding of the entire food chain, food web, including excrement, would lead to an understanding of food culture as a global environmental issue. This idea is extremely important, and I think it lives in the FEAST project as well. Chikyuken will soon invite a new Director General, Professor Juichi Yamagiwa. Yamagiwa-san is one of the active researchers for the Society of WAVE and is also interested in the food issues of humans. After the FEAST project, based on accumulated knowledge, I do hope that a new research project on agricultural issue will start someday under the new Director General. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Satoichiro, for those really kind of deeply well thought out comments and bringing us a bit through time and touching on a number of different key people in the history of the institute that were based and the FEAST project is based was a nice touch, I thought, and kind of bringing together all of these the history and also all the content from the presentations and the symposium. We have one more set of comments, and they will be coming from Tachikawa Masashi, who's based at Nagoya University. He's also a Feast Project member, and we've asked him to give a couple comments on the symposium and making some connections between the different sessions. So Tachikawa-san, are you there and can you share your screen?
Yes.
Yoroshiku onegaishimasu.
Could you see?
Yep,
you can
perfect. See? Go ahead.
Yes, yes. Thank you again. First of all, I really appreciate organizers, presenters, and participants to make this valuable event to happen in this very difficult time under COVID pandemic. So Japan, as you know, we are in a very serious situation. We are under the kind of emergency situation. So throughout 4 days event, I learned a lot, and there are so many important issues have come up during last 4 days. So these slides I will show just my summaries of each presentation in just one line. So sorry, but so there are so many take homes I really appreciate. And I think by summarizing the key message of each presentation, I found many points were emphasized repeatedly. So we have so various commonality, and there are so many important things we have to share. So I have classified them using 4 colors. Those are first, the green one is actions to create relations with each other. The yellow one is focus of intervention. And the third one, the blue one, is how to reach people in an effective way. And the last one is what kind of values are reclaimed. So you can see there are so many issues is presented last 4 days. And this is kind of the, my summary. It's for key take-home message for me. And first of all, as I mentioned, so the connecting and sharing diverse experiences is very important, and already those actions are issue and actions and practice are happening, and we have to share those things. So the keyword is sharing and broker, knowledge broker or networking and informal food system and diversity and space. So it's very important to connect our experience and expand to other maybe mainstream food system. The second one is practice-oriented approach is needed. So there are so many presenters emphasize the practice. The practice means the kind of the, not just focusing on the issue, but also need to include the material or infrastructure or co-production and something. So many things are kind of the locking impact on our behavior. The third one is, as Sato Sensei already emphasized, the narrative or affective or embodiment is very important to reach our message to people. Astrid-san and other members speakers mentioned about gaming or stories. So gaming and stories maybe brings people more to think more seriously and envision the future. That's very important things. I think these issues is not much touched upon by the sustainable transition discussions. The last one is who has power to achieve important societal values. some people, some presenters emphasize the current food system has very much kind of biased against minorities, or so injustice is very important current social problem. But the food and agriculture can have the collective power for this kind of problem issues. So justice and inclusive and self-reliance and resilience, those are very important issues we have to keep. And I think those are key take-home message for me. I think it's very important. But I think there I like to mention 2 points, 2 additional things not mentioned much throughout this conference. First point is that we may be in the edge of the end of the Holocene. As you know, the Holocene is the kind of the period almost last 10,000 years. In the Holocene, we have the very favorable environmental condition for human civilization. So within this Holocene, we develop our ethics or economies and or maybe the domestication process of agriculture. So all issues or social, so every kind of social science principle are developed in the Holocene. But we are in the so-called in the beginning of the Anthropocene, maybe, or the Anthropocene is already started from several decades. So the period of the Holocene is ending. So we have to change our mindset. So as many people discuss as a business as usual, but current business as usual was developed under this kind of very exceptional period of Holocene. So we will face more severe conditions such as extreme climate. So the transformation of food system is needed urgently under this new normal and as Anthropocene. And many people discuss the diversity and resilience is important. So to survive the Anthropocene, so diversity and resilience maybe are keywords for everyone on the earth, I think. And the second point is food system as assemblage. So assemblage means the kind of a resist to change, maybe very difficult to control. So I think every kind of food system should be regarded as assemblage of many different parts, human and non-human and material, culture, meaning, etc. So in other words, it is sometimes very difficult to change food system as intended by humans. So as you see, this assemblage is maybe slip out our hands, and they have their own agency. So very difficult to control. And so we need a deeper understanding for how to transform this assemblage, this very difficult to control system. So that's a kind of very big issues, but still our understanding is very limited. Anyway, this is my very brief comment for this four-day conference. Again, thank you very much for your organization and participation and engagement for this conference in this very difficult time. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Tachikawa Sensei. Really thorough and comprehensive kind of summary of the past 4 days. You saw that he was color coding some of the conclusions. Connecting and sharing diverse experiences, practice-oriented approaches are needed, power of effective embodied narratives and games, and food has power to achieve important societal values. I mean, those are really, really fantastic kind of conclusions coming from the symposium. I'm really quite pleased with that. We have a bit of time if people are willing and able to discuss some of the broader kind of lessons and issues that may have arisen from the symposium. I don't see many mentions or discussions going on in the Slack channel at the moment. But does anybody have any kind of observations or kind of synthesizing comments that they might have to share with the group? I see Christoph maybe is writing something, but maybe he can just jump in and say, food systems have agency.
Sure, yeah.
Go ahead, yeah.
Well, I think that comment was really on point. And even though it didn't really come up, we're using the term agency or the term assemblage during the different presentations. I think most of the presentations actually arrived at the conclusion that making intentional changes to the food system is super, super hard. And often they don't turn out as we hope they would turn out. And lots of different presentations tried to look at approaches to doing that, but in the end, I guess that's one of the conclusions that we have to arrive at, that well, all of these changes that we are trying to make are happening alongside other changes, and not all of these changes come from us or from human actors at all.
Great observation, yeah. I mean, the notion that food systems, existing sort of mainstream food systems fight back or are resistant to change, I think is something that we touched on a bit, but it's something we should remember going forward. And I think as many of the presentations were focused on solutions, the flip side of this is that there are examples of food system solutions out there, but they're still in these sort of niche level kind of rollouts, and that there are also really powerful big ideas such as food as a commons or degrowth that are out there that are moving at different sort of scales and ways of intervening in the system. Ilan, you've got something to say, go ahead.
If I may, I wanted just to follow up on Takachihogo Sensei's, I think, very important point at the end in regard to the Holocene and the Anthropocene. And I think that we really have to be aware that we may be forced, unfortunately, into further really radical transformation, not because of our interests in food systems or anything else, but out of sheer necessity. I mean, we're already seeing that with dealing with drought and salt-resistant plants. I mean, there are lots of examples of pieces of this, but on a global scale, I think that has not been addressed sufficiently. And I do think that if you will, for better and worse, hopefully for better in that we realize that this is coming up. You can sort of see the onrushing train of climate change and the impact of that, and maybe for worse, because it will be substantially harder to do this in a relatively short time, which we face. So I appreciate very much that insight and framing by Takachihogo Sensei.
Yeah, no, that's really a sobering point. And I think, you know, yeah, as academics and folks that are engaging in these sort of solutions, we try to find ways that we can sort of push society or move actors in different ways and take action. But this sort of freight train is coming our way, and whether we like it or not, you know, we're going to be dealing with these things. And you know, the projections for the amount of drawdown we need for CO2 are just, you know, it's like jumping off of a cliff. So, and we only have 10 or I don't know how many years to do this. So, you know, it's really critical that some of these solutions that we've been talking about become, you know, the mainstream discussion. And I think that's something that I think a lot of us in many discussions about GIAS or subsistence agriculture today, we had the discussions around different ways of governance, food policy, etc. They're on the margins at the moment, and these are really our last hope to really have some changes on a massive scale. I mean, food as a commons, for example, and degrowth. Anyone else out there? I think Gregory has been having some audio issues, so we'll sort of leave him. Max, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, can you hear me? I
Sure.
think at this point we could also call up Gregory. I hope we solved the earlier audio issues. But yeah, well, I could just say quickly that. So we talked a lot as researchers. We are focused on finding and identifying practices, solutions, seeds, stories that could be replicated, that could be scaled up or reproduced, because we want to see the mainstream change, right? The mainstream activities in most areas nowadays is a problem, and that needs to change. But at the same time, we have encountered that some actors of these change practices prefer not to be the mainstream. They prefer to be in the pocket. They prefer to be the niche. They don't want to be their practice or their lifestyle mainstream at sometimes. So, so we have to be careful in that sense of not co-opting what is not ours in a way, but at the same time trying to create spaces for other people to have different lives outside of the mainstream. So the question is basically, do we want to break down the mainstream, or do we want to change it or replace it or overtake it or circumvent it? I think that's a kind of discussion that came up in various ways again and again, but it's a problem of academia, and it connects to what Tamura-san also posted, where we have to battle in academia for positions and everything and funding, but yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a great observation. It reminded me a lot of, and Ashley mentioned this in her talk, Eric Oldenwright's work on real world utopias and real utopias. And he discusses, you know, what is the verb you're trying to use against the system? Are you trying to erode? Are you trying to destroy, you know, the mainstream system? What is it that you're trying to do? And I think there may be in the end a kind of pluriverse of different, you know, small little solutions that are out there that may not be scalable. You know, they may not be things that we could sort of scale out and scale up, and that's sort of an assumption we take for granted sometimes. But to think about that in a bit deeper way. Gregory, are you there with us? Can you talk?
Can you hear me?
Fantastic, we got you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it strikes me that we need to consider how can we overcome the inertia, the continuing trajectories of industrial agriculture and other aspects of the global capitalist system. And you know, we've had examples of that in terms of, on a small scale, the need for embodied experiences, for showing rather than telling and such in those great presentations earlier today, beginning with the keynote. But on you've just mentioned that some aspects are not perhaps scalable up. And I'm wondering, how can we use critical junctures? I mentioned in my comment catastrophic events, but that's not the only possible type of critical juncture in order to catalyze these sorts of you know, systemic changes. We need to really look at how crucial failures of the capitalist system can be centered upon in order to change the path to penance and to set a new trajectory up. I'm not sure of all of the ways that we can do that, but perhaps that you know, looking at the notion of critical juncture can help us in that problem of scaling up what can work in terms of community interventions. And I'd be interested to hear from others how they think that might be effectuated. Thank you.
Great. That's excellent, Gregory. It's a great observation. And yeah, we are only going to be having more and more of these sort of catastrophic kind of events here in the future. And does anybody have any quick response for Gregory or reaction? Ilan, I see you raise your hand. Go ahead.
Sorry, I don't mean to monopolize things. I think I think that's a very important observation question, Gregory. One reaction, just a piece of it anyway, is that those critical junctions, in a sense, are moments at which the system may become indeterminate or chaotic. And it is exactly at those points where it is possible to redirect it with relatively less effort than when one is fully trapped in the stasis of path dependence. So, you know, that's what I meant a little bit earlier about for the good and the bad of the changes in our global situation, that it also may force us to reconsider and restructure in response to these really critical points, critical junctions. And the real concern is that the critical junction is also a point where, if we don't find solutions, one crosses into territory in which the system cannot recover to conditions that are amenable to life. So they may be truly transformative, but in ways we don't want. So it's also the chance, perhaps, to identify those and act in a way that is salutary. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you so much, Ilan and Gregory and everybody. I think that we're going to I'm going to wrap this up as we're nearing now a little bit beyond 3.5 hours. So I'm going to share my screen here really quick with a few wrapping up slides, and we'll see how this goes. Okay, I hope everyone can see that. Are we okay? I just wanted to mention, you know, that Arnim Vik in his very first keynote was providing us with this kind of excellent framing that sort of took each of the presentations in the symposium and tried to structure them in this framework of understanding existing solutions, supporting and adopting and transferring solutions, and also then supporting the creation of new solutions at different scales. And I think this will be something that we can really take another hard look at and explore together in the future here, because I think it's been a really nice way of summarizing and looking at all the talks in another through another lens, I should say. And we did do a little bit of discussion about how this might develop further if we talk a bit about more policies and practices, narratives, technologies, etc. And I think there are just a few observations that I have that I'd like to say, and I think we touched on these, you know, changing and transforming the food system, as Christoph says, is a huge challenge. And there's a number of challenges that still remain for us. I think one that was identified time and again is that the economic systems that we're within, that we operate in, that industrial food system operate in, are morally sort of deficient, and we have a moral economy challenge with these sort of values and logics that operate outside of and in opposition to capitalist values and logics, need to be sort of re-embodied in different solutions at different levels. And you know, the discussion that Yorgos brought us on degrowth and the challenges in moving that direction, I think kind of clarify how we are sort of dealing with this deeply moral issue. I mean, food as a commons shouldn't be something that we need to go around and try to convince people that this is the case, but it is something that we need to work on. I think another challenge is the challenge of trying to cobble together all these practices and models from the past and the present and the future to grow. And in this case, we really want to grow real world food utopias. And we talked a little bit about that today with the examples from Ashley's work on shadow structures, but also in Daniel's work about these examples from Gias and past and agricultural heritage, and how do we merge those sort of practices and models and build upon them and develop them further. There's also this challenge of how do we implot ourselves? We didn't use this verb explicitly, but how do we ourselves implot into new narratives in our communities, into new narratives or new social constructions, such as, you know, living as if food was a commons. And we can do this, I guess, through a lot of the examples that were offered through games, storytelling, through art, etc. And I think we need to have more and more of those kinds of sort of media coming out into the world and to help us to do that and plotting. And then finally, you know, Michael Carolyn brought in this experience, this embodied experience perspective with these really kind of incredibly interesting social experiments with people from very different walks of life, but that through those embodied experiences, they were able to empathize or have an effective response, and that those experiences might impact our receptivity to these solutions and these alternatives for our food system in the future. And I think, you know, how do we then scale those up, or how do we have more of those embodied experiences? And maybe that links back to what Gregory was talking about in terms of, you know, these sort of junction points of shared experience. So these challenges remain, and I think they're not going away anytime soon. And we all just sort of have to continue working in our own way toward addressing all these challenges and hopefully then really eliciting the kinds of cultural shifts and food system sustainability transformation we're all seeking together. So, I mean, I'm really, really pleased at the way the symposium carried out and was able to, and people were able to sort of utilize the Zoom and the Slack platforms and come together and have really enriching discussions. I'm really, really happy about that. Just some notes and announcements before we let you all go. All the presentations and session videos will be online on either the YouTube or the RIHN websites. So take a look, revisit some presentations that you really liked, and also then you can get in touch with us through this Slack symposium. It's going to remain up. So in the future, what happens with these Slack platforms is we can kind of shift them into more of a collaborative, into more of a collaborative tool. We can stay in touch and really kind of readdress some of the themes, think about how we can collaborate together. We also discussed a bit about a co-authored paper, and I'll get in touch with some of the folks that we discussed that with and follow up on that. And also there's a feedback survey on the symposium. Please let us know how we can improve. I think someone's going to post that link in the Slack channel now, but also over email we'll let you know. So please give us your feedback. And also one more thing, RIHN is a institution that is a research institution that is always accepting new proposals for projects, and we are recruiting right now. So if you are interested in proposing a project about food, agriculture, anything, having to do with environment and human culture, go ahead and look us up online and propose a project. We're always in the business of finding interesting ideas and bringing people together around this sort of collective task we have to create a more sustainable world and more sustainable culture. And with that, I am finished. I think we've gone a bit over time, but I would just like to extend my thanks to all the folks working hard behind the scenes, everybody over there in the lecture hall at RIHN. Thanks for these 4 days, the International Affairs subunit, all the Feast HQ folks, the UCOs again, lifesavers over and over again, the chairs, and of course all the presenters and the keynote speakers and the panelists. Really, really appreciate your contributions, and we'll be in touch. Thank you so much, and take care.